The emergency sirens began while I was tightening the strap on a stranger's child helmet. 1 second, Timber Ridge was full of laughter and skis scraping over packed snow. The next, a mechanical wail rolled across the mountain as the loudspeaker ordered everyone back to the base lodge. A blizzard had changed direction, and whiteout conditions were expected within the hour. I turned toward the rental racks, searching for Molly. 10 minutes earlier, she had been standing there in her purple jacket, filming Koda for her school project. Now she was gone, and so was the red retirement harness I could always spot across a crowd. Then my parents came running through the snow. My mother was crying before she reached me. My father grabbed both my shoulders and said, "Andrea, listen to me." Molly wandered into the forest. We searched, but the storm became too dangerous. For a moment, every sound vanished except the sirens. I asked where Koda was, and my mother pressed a hand to her mouth. "The dog ran first," she said. Molly chased after him. Koda had served beside me for 6 years through gunfire, smoke, crowded checkpoints, and explosions that shook the ground. He had never broken position without a command or abandoned a person placed in his care. My father pointed toward the eastern tree line. "She went that way. Ski patrol is already looking." His gloves were dry. My mother's boots were almost clean. Neither of them could explain why Molly's camera was no longer hanging from her neck. That was when fear changed shape inside me. My daughter had not wandered away. Someone had taken her, and the 2 people pretending to help me find her already knew exactly where she was. They had left Molly in a closing blizzard with an old military dog they believed was useless. They had forgotten what Koda never had. Family was not who gave the order, but who refused to leave you behind. Before I take you back to that morning, tell me where you are listening from, stay to learn how we found Molly, and subscribe for more stories of family, betrayal, and courage. 6 hours earlier, I still believed the worst thing waiting for me at Timber Ridge was another argument with my father. I had avoided the resort for almost 2 years, limiting visits with my parents to quick lunches in town or carefully supervised holidays at my house. My grandfather had opened Timber Ridge with a single rope tow. My father expanded it into a resort, and my mother turned our name into a local institution. By the time I was old enough to question them, every disagreement ended with the same answer. People depended on us. That sentence excused late inspections, exhausted employees, and decisions outsiders were not supposed to examine. I joined the army partly because I wanted rules that applied to everyone. My parents called it rebellion. I called it breathing. Molly was 12, old enough to notice the distance between me and her grandparents, but young enough to believe it could be repaired. When her teacher assigned a documentary about a life of service, she chose Koda immediately. She had titled it Koda's Last Patrol. "It is not supposed to be sad," she told me as we crossed the parking lot that morning. She held her small camera against her chest while Koda moved carefully beside her. "It is about what happens after everyone stops clapping." His muzzle had gone gray, and cold weather stiffened his left hip. He no longer moved with effortless power, but every few steps he checked Molly, then looked back at me. Retirement had slowed his body without changing his habit of accounting for his people. "That sounds a little sad," I said. "It is honest," Molly replied. My father met us outside the lodge. Dennis Hale was 70, broad-shouldered, and still wore his red mountain jacket as if it were a uniform no one else had earned. His eyes moved from me to Koda, lingering on the dog's careful gait. "That dog earned his rest," he said. "You should stop making him prove himself." The words sounded considerate, but I knew my father. Anything that could no longer work at full capacity became an expense or an obstacle. I rested a hand on Koda's harness. "He is here because Molly wanted him here. No one is asking him to prove anything." Dad gave the small shrug he used when he wanted everyone to believe a disagreement had ended because he was too reasonable to continue it. "Just keep him out of the main traffic. We have a full mountain today." My mother arrived and wrapped Molly in a hug. Paula looked elegant even in snow boots, with silver hair beneath a cream hat and an instantly reassuring smile. She admired Molly's camera and suggested several scenic locations. "You should film the old overlook," she said. "West Ridge is where your mother learned to ski. She used to stand at the top and argue with the wind." "I did not argue with the wind," I said. "You argued with everything," Mom replied warmly, as if my childhood resistance had been charming rather than necessary. A sign near the lift entrance read, "West Ridge closed, maintenance and wind conditions." Molly pointed her camera toward it, but Dad stepped into the frame. "Temporary precaution," he said. "We will have it open again soon." The upper trees were already moving harder than those below, and low clouds pressed against the mountain. As a safety inspector, I distrusted anyone who called a closure temporary before the cause was resolved. As Dennis Hale's daughter, I knew how quickly a practical question became an accusation of disloyalty. I chose silence. It was the first mistake I recognized only later. At 10:30, the resort tested its emergency system. A short siren sounded, followed by a message explaining that 3 continuous tones meant everyone must return to the base lodge. Molly covered one ear while Koda merely blinked. Joel Reyes, the ski patrol director, came down the steps with a radio and weather tablet. He was competent and careful, but years under my father had trained him to seek permission when judgment should have been enough. "Wind is building sooner than predicted," he told Dad. "I want the upper patrol pulled by 2. Dad glanced at the sky, and then at the crowded lift line. "Check the next update first. We have time." Joel hesitated before nodding. I had seen that hesitation in too many employees. They knew the mountain. My father owned it. Everyone behaved as if those were the same thing. Molly filmed Koda beside the fire pit, near an old patrol sled, and along the public walkway. She asked about his service, but I kept my answers simple. Her project was about life after duty, not turning old danger into entertainment. When I found her kneeling beside him near the equipment racks, she was slipping a spare memory card into the small identification pouch attached to his red harness. "Molly, that pocket holds his emergency card," I said. "It is not storage for your camera junk." She grinned and removed the card. "It fits perfectly. So does a coin in a light socket. That does not make it a good idea." She laughed, tucked the card into her coat, and promised to keep the pouch clear. Koda watched us with the patient expression of someone who had endured much worse arguments. Near noon, Molly asked whether she could film a few exterior shots by the maintenance area. I looked toward the marked public path running beside the building. "Stay on the visitor side of the fence," I told her. "Do not enter a garage, do not follow an employee through a gate, and keep your phone on." "I know, Mom." That answer usually means you stop listening after the first rule. She kissed my cheek, clipped Koda's leash to his harness, and walked away with the camera raised. I watched until her purple jacket and his red harness reached the public path. Giving her independence felt like loosening my grip one finger at a time. A few minutes later, Paula's dark SUV rolled past the maintenance building instead of toward the guest parking lot. Molly noticed it and shifted her camera to follow. Koda had been walking slowly at her side, but his head rose with sudden precision. His nostrils worked once, then again. The leash tightened in Molly's hand as he angled toward the vehicle. I was still far enough away to tell myself it might mean nothing. Then Koda stopped beside the rear of my mother's SUV, lowered his hindquarters into the snow, and fixed his eyes on the cargo compartment. Molly lifted her camera higher, smiling as though she had just captured the moment her old soldier returned to work. From where I stood near the lodge, I saw Molly crouch beside Koda and bring the camera close to his face. His body had gone still, his ears forward, his attention fixed on the rear cargo area of my mother's SUV. Molly did not shout or pull him away. I had taught her that when Koda gave a passive alert, she should not interrupt him, reward him, or guess what he had found. She should step back and call me. She turned in my direction, searching through the people moving between the lodge and the lifts. Before our eyes met, Joel called me to the patrol steps to look at an updated wind map. I glanced away for less than a minute. That minute changed everything. Most of what happened beside the SUV came back to me later through Molly's account, and the footage hidden on her memory card. I watched it so many times afterward that every movement became lodged in my mind as if I had stood beside her. The recording began with Koda filling most of the frame. Snow gathered along his red harness while he stared at the cargo door. Molly whispered, "He is doing the quiet sit." That was what she called his alert. Not explosives or danger, only the quiet sit. It was the phrase I had used when she was younger and asked why Koda sometimes became as still as a statue in old photographs. A door slammed beyond the camera. My father appeared from behind the SUV, moving faster than a 70-year-old man usually did on packed snow. "Get him away from there," he snapped. The camera dipped as Molly looked up. I did not tell him to do anything. I said move him. His anger was too sharp for a dog sitting beside a parked vehicle. Molly must have felt it too, because her next words came softly. "Mom told me not to interrupt him when he sits like this." My mother stepped into view before Dad could answer. Her expression was calm, but one hand closed tightly around the tablet against her coat. "It is all right, sweetheart," she said. Koda probably recognizes the scent from the avalanche control equipment. We sometimes carry supplies between maintenance buildings. Molly shifted the camera toward the SUV as my father unlocked the rear hatch. Inside was a dark case with reinforced corners and metal latches. Dad pulled it toward him and lifted it out with both hands. "Should that be in Grandma's car?" Molly asked. Dad looked directly into the lens. "You should not be filming in a maintenance area. I am on the visitor side. This is still resort property." While he carried the case toward the service door, my mother woke the tablet screen. A message flashed across the top. She tapped through several pages and said, "Mark's login still works. We only need the ridge open through Sunday." Dad stopped for half a second. Molly turned the camera toward my mother. "Who is Mark?" Mom's eyes lifted from the screen. The pause before she smiled was brief, but it was there. "An employee who is taking some time off," she said. "Adults share access when someone is away." That answer might have satisfied Molly if my father had not returned and reached for the camera. "Delete this," he said. Molly stepped back. Koda rose with her, positioning himself between her legs and my father without growling. "It is for school," she said. "I can cut out the maintenance building. I am not asking you to edit it. I am telling you to erase it." She held the camera against her chest. Her voice shook, but she did not challenge him like an adult. "Mom will know what Koda was doing. She can help me choose which part is okay." My mother's expression changed at the mention of me. She knew I would recognize Koda's alert and hear the sentence about Mark's login. More importantly, she knew Molly would remember both, even if the footage disappeared. Mom stepped closer and softened her voice. "Of course Andrea can help. Does that little camera save your videos online automatically?" Molly looked down at the screen. "Sometimes. It depends on the signal. Can you check?" The request sounded helpful, but Molly later told me it made the skin along her arms tighten. My mother had never cared where her videos were stored. Molly pretended to check the battery compartment. With the camera turned against her coat, she slid out the memory card. Her spare card was still in her pocket from when I had made her remove it from Koda's identification pouch. She switched the cards, put the blank one into the camera, and closed the cover. Then she crouched beside Koda as though adjusting his harness and slipped the real card into the pouch I had told her not to use. That small act of disobedience later saved the truth. My mother watched her hands, but Koda shifted and blocked the pouch from view. Molly stood and showed the camera screen. "No signal," she said. A warning tone came from Mom's tablet. A red banner appeared across the display. "Mountain closure advanced. Severe weather approaching. Upper access to be cleared." My father read it over her shoulder. "How much time?" "Less than they predicted." He looked toward Molly, then toward the lodge where I was speaking with Joel. "We take the camera and handle it inside the family," he said quietly. Mom kept her eyes on Molly. "Taking it does not change what she saw." Dad's jaw tightened. "Then what are you suggesting?" My mother lowered the tablet. Her voice was too low for Molly to hear every word, but the camera caught enough. "Then we make sure there is no story for Andrea to hear." Molly did not understand what that meant. At 12, she still believed adults used terrible words when they were angry and regretted them later. She thought her grandparents might be hiding a rule violation, not deciding what to do with a witness. Mom turned back with the warm smile she used in Christmas photographs. "I have an idea," she said. "Your film needs one beautiful ending. Let us take Koda to the old West Ridge Overlook and record one final patrol. Your mother used to walk that route with ski patrol." Molly looked toward the West Ridge closed sign. "Mom said I had to stay on the public path." "That is why it will be a surprise," Mom replied. "You can show her when it is finished." "I thought West Ridge was closed." Dad returned the case to the SUV and shut the hatch. "Closed to guests. We own the service road, and we are not going anywhere dangerous. The weather alert said the upper area has to be cleared. We will be back before they finish closing the lifts," he said. 10 minutes up, 10 minutes down." Molly hesitated. "She wanted to come find me. I know because she turned toward the lodge and lifted one hand as if she might wave." Koda followed her gaze. Even in the footage, I could see him looking across the snow toward where I stood, waiting for a command that never came. My mother placed an arm around Molly's shoulders. "Imagine your mom's face when she sees Koda standing where she grew up," she said. "You want this to mean something to her, do you not?" That was the lever they used. Not Molly's recklessness, but her love for me. She nodded, clipped Koda's leash shorter, and led him toward the rear door. My father opened it before she could change her mind. Koda paused with his front paws inside and looked back toward the lodge. Molly gave the leash a gentle pull. "Come on, boy. One last patrol." He climbed in beside her. The SUV left the maintenance loop and followed the narrow service lane toward West Ridge. When Dad entered his access code, the metal gate lifted through the falling snow. A red weather alert glowed on the dashboard. Molly leaned forward to read it, but my mother reached across and dismissed the warning before the full message appeared. The gate lowered behind them. The gate disappeared behind the SUV as my father drove higher into West Ridge. Everything that happened during the next half hour came to me later in fragments. Some details Molly told me from her hospital bed. Others I learned from the tire marks, the gate records, and the brief images left on the blank card inside her camera. By then, I had replayed her journey so often that I could see the road through her eyes. Snow swept across the windshield in thin, fast lines. The service road narrowed as it climbed between dark pines, and the buildings near the main resort vanished below them. Molly sat in the back seat with Koda beside her. One hand rested on his red harness while she watched for the overlook my mother had promised. They passed a wooden sign nearly buried in snow. "Old West Ridge Overlook," it read, with an arrow pointing toward a short turnout on the left. Molly leaned forward. "Was that it?" My father kept driving. "There is a better view farther up," he said. "The trees block the mountain from there." My mother turned in her seat and smiled. "Your grandfather knows every camera angle on this ridge." That answer reassured Molly for another minute. She wanted the footage to be beautiful. She wanted me to see Koda standing somewhere connected to my childhood and understand that she had made the trip for me. The road grew rougher. Branches bent under fresh snow, and the wind pushed powder across the tracks almost as soon as the tires made them. Koda shifted beside her. His back legs took longer to settle each time the SUV jolted over frozen ruts. Molly rubbed the fur above his hip. "We should not keep him out long," she said. "The cold makes him stiff." "We will not," my mother replied. "Just one short scene." They passed a low concrete structure built into the slope. A rusted metal door faced the road, partly hidden behind a drift. Above it hung an old warning sign with faded red letters. Authorized maintenance personnel only. Koda lifted his head and watched the structure until it vanished behind them. Molly noticed because he rarely followed buildings with his eyes. She looked back through the rear window, but the falling snow swallowed it almost immediately. My father drove another quarter-mile before stopping near a line of trees. There was no overlook, no railing, and no view of the mountain. Only a narrow clearing beside the road, and a steep white slope descending into the forest. "This is not the place from your pictures," Molly said. "The old pictures were taken before the trees grew in," he answered. My mother opened her door. Wind rushed into the SUV, carrying snow across the seats. "Give me your phone and camera before you get out," she said. "The batteries will die faster in this cold." Molly tightened her grip on the camera. "I want to film Koda walking down. Your grandfather has a better camera in the cargo area. I already set this one up." My mother's face changed, not into anger, but hurt. It was the expression she had used on me throughout my childhood, whenever I questioned something she had already decided. "Molly, we brought you somewhere special even though the ridge is closed. Do you really think we would damage your camera?" "No." "Then why are you arguing?" Molly looked down. She was 12, standing between two adults she had been taught to respect. Refusing them felt less like protecting herself, and more like accusing them of something terrible. She handed my mother the camera, and then her phone. The real memory card remained inside Koda's identification pouch. Dad came around to the back door and helped Koda down. The dog landed carefully, pausing while his hind legs adjusted to the snow. Molly climbed out after him and pulled her hood tighter around her face. My mother stayed near the SUV with the devices. She removed the battery from Molly's phone and slipped both items into her coat. Molly did not see that. She was watching my father walk toward the edge of the clearing. "Bring Koda over here," he called. "We will do a practice shot first." He handed her his phone. The camera application was open, but no recording indicator appeared when she pressed the screen. "It is not working," she said. "I probably locked it by mistake." He pointed toward a stand of trees farther down the service road. "Walk him to that marker and come back. I will fix it." There was no marker Molly could see, only a bent post partly covered by snow. She took several steps with Koda. The wind pressed against her back and sent loose powder around her boots. When she turned, my father was already walking toward the SUV. "Where are you going?" "To get the tripod." My mother opened the passenger door. "And Koda's blanket. We will be back in 2 minutes." Molly stayed where she was, holding my father's useless phone. She watched them climb into the SUV and expected the vehicle to reverse toward her. The engine started. For a moment, it did exactly what she expected. The SUV backed along the road and turned until the headlights faced downhill. Molly assumed Dad needed room to reposition it. Then he accelerated. "Grandpa?" The SUV continued down the service road. Molly ran after it. Koda moved with her, but his pace was slower, and the leash pulled tight between them. "Wait!" My father did not brake. My mother did not open her door or look back long enough for Molly to see her face. Molly ran until her boots slipped beneath her. She caught herself with one hand and dropped the phone into the snow. By the time she stood, the taillights were fading between the trees. She grabbed the device and pressed the emergency call button. The screen remained locked, and the signal icon showed nothing. Her own phone was in my mother's pocket. For several seconds, Molly told herself they had gone to find help. Perhaps the road was too narrow to turn around. Perhaps the tripod was stored somewhere below. Perhaps they expected her to stay still. She called after them again. Only the wind answered. Fresh snow softened the tire tracks. The two red lights appeared once more between the trees, then vanished beyond the service gate. That was the moment she understood they were not coming back. Molly started downhill. The base lodge had to be somewhere beyond the trees, and she believed running was better than waiting. Panic reduced the mountain to a single thought. Find Mom. Koda moved in front of her and stopped. "Come on," she said, trying to step around him. He shifted with her, keeping his body across the road. His ears were back, and snow had begun collecting along his spine. Koda, we have to go. He did not obey. Then she remembered what I had taught her during winter hikes. Never run when you cannot see the route. Moving faster does not help if every step takes you farther from shelter. Wind steals heat first, panic steals judgment second, and both can kill you before the cold feels unbearable. Molly looked downhill. The road was already disappearing beneath the snow. If she left it and entered the trees, she might never find it again. Koda turned uphill instead. He pulled gently toward the route the SUV had taken before stopping. Not deeper into the forest, but back along the tracks they had already made. Molly followed. The wind struck her face as they climbed. Koda's pace became uneven, and twice his left hind leg slipped. Each time, Molly stopped and let him regain his balance. "You can leave me," she whispered once. Koda looked back at her, then continued toward the place where he had watched the old maintenance door. The utility building was farther away than Molly remembered. The storm changed distances, hiding familiar shapes until they were almost close enough to touch. She kept one hand on Koda's harness, so neither of them could disappear from the other. By the time the dark outline emerged through the snow, Koda was breathing hard. The concrete walls were half buried, and ice sealed the bottom of the metal door. Molly reached for the handle. It did not move. She pulled again, using both hands. The door remained shut. Behind her, the road had vanished. At the base lodge, I finished looking through the rental area and checked my phone again. Molly had not answered my last 2 messages. I told myself she was still filming near the maintenance path, but the weather announcement changed before I could reach it. A warning voice ordered all guests to return to the lodge immediately. I turned toward the equipment racks where Molly had promised to meet me. Her purple jacket was not there. Neither was Koda's red harness. Then the emergency sirens began. Far above us, Molly looked at the old dog standing beside her in the whiteout. "They knew this was coming," she said. By the time my parents reached me, the first wave of guests was already pouring toward the base lodge. Children cried beneath the sirens. Ski patrol shouted directions through the wind, while employees pulled barriers across the lift entrances. My mother stumbled through the crowd, with both hands pressed to her mouth. My father followed close behind, breathing hard enough to sound convincing. "Andrea," he said, gripping my shoulders. "Molly is missing." The words struck harder even though I already knew she was gone. "Where did you see her?" Dad pointed toward the eastern tree line beyond the rental building. Koda took off toward the woods. Molly ran after him before we could stop her. Mom reached for my arm. "We searched, sweetheart. We went as far as we could, but the wind became too dangerous." I looked at the trees, then back at them. Panic begged me to run in whichever direction they pointed. Training forced me to stand still long enough to ask what panic did not want answered. "What was Molly wearing?" Mom blinked. "Her purple coat." "What color were her snow pants?" "Black," Dad said. "They are navy." "What time did you last see her?" "About 10 minutes ago," Mom answered. Dad spoke almost at the same time. "Closer to 20. They looked at each other. I kept my voice level. "Who had her camera?" "She did," Dad said. Mom shook her head. "No, I think she left it near the rental racks." My eyes moved to Molly's usual place beside the equipment rack. Her camera bag was gone. Was Koda wearing his leash? Dad's hand tightened on my shoulder. "Andrea, this is not the time for an interrogation." "It is exactly the time. Was he wearing it?" Mom answered first. "I do not remember." "He had the red leash when he left with Molly," I said. "Did she drop it? Did he pull free? Which one of them entered the trees first?" Dad pointed again. "The dog ran. Molly followed." "Through which gap?" His fingers shifted slightly toward a wider opening between the pines. "There." Mom stepped closer and wrapped her arms around me before I could move away. "I am frightened too," she whispered. She is my granddaughter. Her coat was cold from the air, but not soaked. Her gloves were dry, except for a light dusting of snow across the fingertips. Dad's pants were clean from the knees down. Neither of them had pine needles caught in their clothes or packed snow around their boots. Anyone who had searched through those trees would have carried half the forest back with them. I pulled away from Mom. Why is Molly not wearing her camera? The question made Dad frown. What are you talking about? You said she ran into the woods. You knew she did not have the camera around her neck. Mom glanced at him. Perhaps I noticed before she disappeared. You just said you thought she left it by the rental racks. Before she could answer, Joel Reyes came through the crowd with 4 patrollers. One carried a medical pack. Another unfolded a map across a bench, sheltered by the lodge wall. Joel looked at me. We need a last known location. Dad moved between us and placed his hand on the map. East Gully, he said. Send everyone there. Joel hesitated. Did you actually see them enter the gully? I saw them cross the tree line. The lower trail funnels east. I stepped closer. Koda did not run away. Dad turned on me. You were not there. I trained him. He does not leave position to chase an animal or follow a random scent. He would not pull Molly into the forest. Mom's face folded into sorrow as several employees gathered around us. Andrea, Koda is old, she said gently. You love him, but you have not wanted to admit how confused he has become. He is not confused. You cannot know that every second. He has never done anything like this. That does not mean he could not start today. A woman near the rental desk looked toward the eastern trees with sudden fear. One of the patrollers muttered that an aging dog might have followed wildlife. Mom had planted the explanation quickly, and I watched it spread because it offered everyone something simple to believe. An old dog wandered. A child followed. A storm arrived. No one had to ask why my parents were lying. Joel tapped the map. I will send 2 teams into East Gully and 1 along the lower boundary. Andrea, you can come with me. Part of me wanted to seize my mother by the shoulders and force the truth out of her. Another part already pictured Molly alone somewhere above us, losing warmth while I wasted time arguing. I chose Molly. Start the search, I said, but preserve every camera recording, gate log, and vehicle access record from the last hour. Do not let anything overwrite. Dad stared at me. Why are you turning this into an investigation? Because we need to know exactly where she went. We know where she went. No, you gave us a direction. His jaw tightened. Every minute you spend doubting us is a minute your daughter is out there. I felt the cruelty of the sentence, but I did not let it move me. If she wandered away, the records will support your story. Joel looked from my father to me. Years of working under Dennis showed in the caution on his face. The gate system keeps a local history, he said. The cameras should still be recording. Then protect them now. Dad leaned over the map. Search first. Deal with computers later. Joel finally nodded to one of the employees. Tell security not to delete or reset anything. Lock the last 2 hours of footage. My father's eyes hardened, but he did not challenge Joel in front of the patrol team. The search groups moved out within minutes. Bright jackets disappeared between the eastern trees, while the storm blurred the mountain behind them. I followed Joel as far as the rental area, then stopped. Something about the route felt wrong. If Molly had been standing beside the rental racks when Koda ran, there should have been marks in the snow. Hundreds of people had crossed the area, but fresh tracks still showed near the edges where employees had not yet shoveled. I walked the line from the racks to the opening Dad had indicated. There were ski boots, adult snow boots, and the narrow tracks of children being guided toward the lodge. I found no clear prints matching Molly's boots, and no paw marks from a large dog. Joel called from the tree line. Andrea, are you coming? Give me 2 minutes. Molly's skis were still locked into the rack, exactly where I had left them that morning. Her poles stood beside them. She could have walked into the trees in snow boots, But Koda could not have crossed the open area without leaving prints. The snow was too fresh. I turned toward the maintenance side of the lodge instead. A teenage rental employee was gathering abandoned helmets into a cart. His name tag read Evan. I stopped him and showed him a photograph of Molly on my phone. "Did you see this girl afternoon?" He studied the screen. "She was filming the dog." "Where?" "Near the maintenance path." "Did you see her come back?" He looked toward my parents. They stood beneath the lodge overhang with Mom, pressed against Dad's chest, both facing the search teams in the distance. "I saw her with the older lady," Evan said quietly. "My mother?" He nodded. They walked toward the parking lot. The dog was with them. Was Molly upset? No. She looked excited. Your mom had her arm around her. Did they return? I do not know. A dark SUV pulled out from that side a few minutes later. My stomach tightened. Which direction? Toward the service access. Dad had told us Molly ran from the base lodge. Mom had said they followed her into the forest. There were no tracks. Molly's skis had never moved, and a witness had seen her walking willingly toward their vehicle. They had not mistaken where she disappeared. They had created the place where they wanted us to search. Far above the resort, Molly later told me she was still fighting the frozen door of the old valve house. The handle would move less than an inch before the ice locked it again. Koda stood close behind her, sheltering her legs from the wind as much as his body could. She looked back toward the road, but the tracks were already gone. Continuing uphill meant leaving the only structure they had found. Going downhill meant walking blind into the storm. Molly hooked the metal clip of Koda's leash beneath the door handle and pulled until her hands hurt. The ice cracked but did not release. She had to choose whether to spend the strength she had left on the door or abandon it for a road she could no longer see. At the base lodge, I walked back toward my parents. Mom saw me coming and began crying harder, building the expression before I reached her. I stopped an arm's length away. "Why did Molly leave the base lodge in your car?" My mother stopped crying for 1 second. It was long enough for me to see the face behind the performance. My mother recovered quickly. "We took her to the parking lot because she wanted another angle of Koda," she said. Then she walked back toward the lodge. "That is the last time we saw her." Evan stood behind me with both hands gripping the helmet cart. He looked frightened, but not confused. "You left in the SUV," I said. Dad stepped between us. "Andrea, patrol teams are already in the trees. Every minute you spend accusing us is a minute they are searching without you. Where did the SUV go?" "To the maintenance loop." "What time did you return?" I did not check my watch. "You gave Joel an exact time when you claimed Molly ran into the forest." His mouth tightened. Mom reached for my hand, but I moved away. "She may have gone back for Koda after we left," she said. Koda was in the vehicle with her. Joel, who had returned for another radio battery, stopped beside us. Mom looked toward Evan. "Did you actually see the dog inside?" "I saw the red harness through the rear window." Dad turned on him. "You were working 50 feet away in heavy traffic." "I know what I saw." "Then you should know better than to distract a mother whose child is missing." Evan lowered his eyes. Dad did not need to prove him wrong. He only needed to make telling the truth feel dangerous. I stepped between them. "Evan, thank you. Tell security exactly what you saw. Then wait for Joel." Dad gave a humorless laugh. "You are issuing orders on my property now?" "I am trying to find my daughter." Mom looked at Joel with measured concern. "Andrea goes into command mode when she is frightened. After she came home from deployment, she barely slept for months. Sometimes she sees threats before she has all the facts." She said it gently, which made it crueler. I did not defend myself. Every second spent proving I was stable was a second my parents controlled the conversation. "The facts are simple," I told Joel. Molly was seen walking toward their SUV with Koda. Their vehicle left through the service side. They told us she ran from the base lodge into East Gully. Those stories cannot both be true. Joel's radio crackled. One Eastern team reported no tracks beyond the first tree line. Dad pointed toward the radio. They are doing their jobs. Let them. Then show us where your car went. The maintenance loop. Open the vehicle access record. He stared at me, as if I had asked him to confess. Far above us, Molly was still fighting the frozen door. She later told me she stopped pulling when her gloves became wet with melted snow. My voice came back to her as instruction. Wet fabric against skin could become more dangerous than the cold. She wiped her gloves against her coat and forced herself to breathe slowly. Koda stood beside her with his head low. Snow clung to his muzzle, and his left hind leg trembled when he shifted his weight. Molly unclipped the metal hook from his leash and wedged it beneath the frozen handle. She wrapped the leash around both hands, planted one boot against the concrete wall, and leaned back. The ice cracked. She pulled again. Frozen snow broke from the bottom seal, and the door moved barely an inch. Wind screamed through the gap. Molly repositioned the hook and dragged the door inward. Koda could not open it for her. He could only remain beside her while she did it. The room beyond was dark and unheated, but the walls stopped the wind. Pipes ran along one side. A wooden bench stood against the other, with a folded maintenance tarp beneath it. Molly guided Koda inside and forced the door mostly shut. The latch would not catch, so she looped the leash handle around a pipe to keep the wind from pulling it open. An old first aid box held bandages, a thin reflective blanket, and a plastic whistle. Molly spread the tarp across the floor before asking Koda to lie down. His hip was stiff, but he did not flinch when she checked his leg. He was hurting, not badly injured. She sat beside him and pulled the reflective blanket around them. Koda settled nearest the door, his back toward the seam where cold air entered. Molly kept talking because silence made the storm feel closer. "I should have asked Mom," she told him. "I wanted her to think I could do something by myself." Koda breathed heavily and turned his head whenever her voice changed. He did not understand the confession. He only checked that she was still there. Molly flexed her fingers, moved her toes, and kept her breathing slow enough not to sweat beneath her layers. She remembered me telling her that survival was rarely one brave act. It was a series of small decisions that prevented the next mistake. Her hand brushed Koda's identification pouch. The memory card was still inside. Until then, she had believed my parents took the camera because they wanted to hide where they had driven. Holding the pouch, she understood the fear had begun earlier, beside the SUV, when Koda sat down and she recorded the metal case. They had abandoned her because of what she had seen. At the base lodge, Joel rubbed a hand over his face. "The gate system keeps a local entry log," he said, "but the administrator panel requires the owner password." I looked at Dad. "Give it to him." He answered no before Joel had even finished turning toward him. "Dennis, if the SUV crossed a controlled gate, the log could narrow the search area," Joel said. "My vehicle never left the maintenance loop. Then the record will confirm that." Dad glanced toward the guests gathered inside the lodge. Parents held children close, while employees passed out blankets and hot drinks. He was no longer speaking only to me. He was protecting the image of a man in control. "The security network has nothing to do with a child following a dog into the woods," he said. "A child you claim you were searching for." Mom stepped closer to Joel. "Opening private systems during an emergency could disrupt operations. Dennis is trying to keep everyone safe." I looked at her clean boots, then at Dad's dry gloves. "He is trying to keep us from seeing where he went." Joel's radio sounded again. The 2nd Eastern team had found no sign of Molly or Koda. Wind was closing their tracks almost as quickly as they could make them. Dad seized on the report. "Send more people east." "We do not have unlimited teams," Joel said. "Visibility is failing." "Then stop wasting time on computers." A parking attendant hurried in from the side entrance. Joel had sent security to question everyone near the service lot. "I saw Mrs. Hale's SUV use the service access," he said. "The girl and the dog were in the back." Dad's face changed. "Which road?" I asked. The vehicle turned beyond the maintenance loop. Dad pointed at him. "You saw a dark vehicle in a snowstorm. It had your access decal." Mom touched my arm. Even if Molly rode with us briefly, that does not mean we harmed her. We dropped her near the lodge, and she must have gone looking for Koda afterward. You just said Koda was with her in the vehicle. I am frightened. I may be mixing up the order. Dad turned to Joel. This is what she does. She traps people in details, while the real problem gets worse. The real problem was Molly, and he was the only person refusing the record that might locate her. A grandfather looking for his granddaughter would open every record he had, I said. You are protecting one. His composure broke. There was nothing on West Ridge worth finding. The people closest to us fell silent. I had never mentioned West Ridge. High on the mountain, Molly heard what she thought was an engine. She lifted the whistle and blew until her chest hurt, but the wind swallowed the sound. At the lodge, I held my father's gaze and turned to Joel. Open the West Ridge gate log now, or I will tell every parent in this lodge that the owners are refusing to show where their car went with my child inside. For several seconds, no one moved. My father had said West Ridge before any of us had named it. Joel looked at him, then at me, and I saw the moment caution gave way to responsibility. We are opening the local log, Joel said. Dad stepped toward him. You do that without my authorization, and you will not have a job when this storm is over. Joel's face tightened, but he did not look away. A child is missing. I will deal with my job later. He led us into the small security office behind the rental desk. The room smelled of wet coats and overheated electronics. A bank of monitors showed lift stations, parking lanes, and sections of the base lodge blurred by snow. Dad remained near the door, as though he could still control what we saw by standing between us and the rest of the resort. Mom stayed beside him with both arms folded tightly across her chest. Joel entered his credentials into the local system. When the access history appeared, he filtered it to the West Ridge service gate. The first relevant line showed my father's code opening the gate at 2:08 that afternoon. The second showed the same code reopening it at 2:33. I stared at the times. 25 minutes. Long enough to drive Molly into the closed area, take her devices, leave her, and return before the sirens began. Joel clicked the camera tab. The recording skipped from 2:05 to 2:17, then jumped again before the vehicle returned. Why is the footage missing? I asked. Joel shook his head. The camera may have lost connection. The gate controller keeps its own log, so that record remained. Dad stepped forward. I checked a maintenance issue. That is all. Why did you not tell us that when Molly went missing? Because it had nothing to do with her. You went through a closed gate minutes before she disappeared. She was not in the vehicle. Mom nodded quickly. The parking employee saw a coat through snowfall and assumed it was Molly. He was mistaken. Joel switched to the parking camera. The image was grainy and partly blocked by a snow-covered support beam. A dark SUV crossed the frame. Through the rear side window, a patch of purple appeared behind the driver's seat. Beside it was the unmistakable shape of Koda's head and upright ears. My mother stared at the monitor without speaking. I turned to Joel. Move the search to West Ridge. He did not answer immediately. His eyes went to a weather map on the second screen. The service road is closed, he said. The upper wind has increased. Visibility is less than 50 feet in places, and the slope above the old access route has become unstable. My daughter is there. I believe she may be, but sending a full team in could create more victims. If that slope releases, we lose everyone on the road. I forced myself not to demand what he could not safely give. Joel knew the mountain and commanded the patrol team. My job was to make sure his decision included the truth. Their SUV entered West Ridge with Molly and Koda inside. I said. It returned without them. There are no tracks leading from the base lodge to East Gully. My parents sent every search team away from the only confirmed route. Whatever the risk is, West Ridge is where the evidence points. Joel looked at the monitor again. Dad pushed past me. You will not send people up there based on a shadow and her paranoia. Joel's voice stayed controlled. I will send one snowcat with a limited team along the service road. No one leaves the vehicle without a confirmed reason. That machine could trigger a slide, Dad said. You could kill 4 people trying to find someone who is not there. I faced him. How are you so certain Molly is not there? His eyes shifted away. Mom moved between us and lowered her voice. Andrea, think about what you are doing. If this turns into an official investigation, Timber Ridge could be closed for months. My daughter is missing. Hundreds of people depend on this resort. They have mortgages and children. If you accuse us publicly and you are wrong, the entire town will remember who destroyed their jobs. She was still trying to make the consequences of their choices belong to me. And Molly? I asked. What does she remember if she survives? Mom flinched at the word survives. You are frightening yourself, she said. You always imagine the worst possible outcome. No, I am looking at the route your car took. If Timber Ridge closes, Molly will live with what her mother caused. I had heard versions of that sentence all my life. If I spoke, someone lost work. If I refused, the family suffered. If I told the truth, I was responsible for what the truth exposed. This time, there was no hesitation left in me. Molly did not put those jobs at risk, I said. You did. Joel called 2 patrollers into the office. He assigned Leah Morrison to medical support and Tom Briggs to route observation. Then he told security to keep Dad and Mom inside the base lodge until law enforcement could reach the resort. Dad laughed coldly. You have no authority to detain us. I am not detaining you, Joel replied. I am telling you that leaving during an active rescue will be documented. The room erupted into movement. Radios were checked, medical packs sealed, and chains secured around the snowcat tires. I stood near the door while Joel reviewed the route. Across the lodge, Mom pulled Dad close. Their faces were turned partly away, but I saw the urgency in her posture. She whispered something. The storm and the surrounding voices swallowed most of it, but I caught 4 words. Move the cases before patrol. Dad glanced toward the security office. Mom continued, quieter. I heard only the end. The old hut. Before I could reach them, an employee pushed a supply cart between us. Dad and Mom separated. He walked toward the staff corridor, while she headed toward the public restrooms. Joel, I called. They are leaving. He spoke into his radio and told security to watch both exits. Then he looked at me. We have to go now. The snowcat waited beyond the equipment shed, its engine vibrating through the ground. Joel took the driver's position. Tom sat beside him with the route map, while Leah and I secured ourselves in the rear. As soon as we left the base area, the resort disappeared behind white. The headlights created a short tunnel through blowing snow. Everything beyond it was movement without shape. The machine crawled uphill, while wind struck the metal body hard enough to make Leah glance toward the slope. Joel kept the speed low and followed the service markers one at a time. When a post appeared in the headlights, Tom confirmed the number before we continued. I had not traveled that road in years, but the turns returned before the landmarks did. A steep bend near an old drainage cut. A flat section where the ridge blocked the western wind. Then the short turnout leading to the overlook Mom had mentioned to Molly. We passed it. That was the old overlook, I said. Joel glanced at the map. The gate record only tells us the vehicle entered. It does not show how far. My father told Molly he was taking her there. If they passed it, he was never bringing her to the overlook. The road narrowed beyond the turnout. My hands were clenched so tightly that the gloves hurt my fingers. I tried to picture Molly in the whiteout without letting the image become larger than the facts. She had proper winter clothing. Koda was with her. The service road contained several old maintenance structures. Those things mattered. Fear wanted only one conclusion. I needed every possibility that kept her alive. A faded marker appeared beside the road and vanished behind us. Stop, I said. Joel slowed but did not halt. What did you see? There used to be a valve house below this section. Concrete walls, metal door. It controlled the old snowmaking line. Tom checked the map. Nothing is marked here. It was removed from the guest maps years ago. The building may still be there. Joel looked toward the lower side of the road. The slope dropped away into blowing snow, and no structure was visible. "We cannot see 10 yards down," he said. Molly later told me that inside the valve house, the engine became more than a distant sound. The pipes began to tremble faintly before she could hear the snowcat clearly. Koda lifted his head. He had been lying beside the door with his back against the cold seam. When the vibration reached the floor, he pushed himself upright. His left hind leg shook, but his attention sharpened. Molly brought the plastic whistle to her mouth and blew. The sound seemed loud inside the concrete room, yet outside it vanished into the storm. She tried again, then grabbed a loose metal bar resting near the wall. She struck it against one of the pipes. The impact rang through the building. In the snowcat, I thought I heard something beneath the engine. "Stop the vehicle." Joel slowed further. "Turn it off," I said. He looked toward the slope. "If we shut down here, restarting in this wind could be difficult." I heard something. Tom opened his side vent for a second, then closed it against the snow. "I heard only the track." "Please." Joel killed the engine. The sudden silence felt enormous. Wind moved around the snowcat, pushing powder against the windows. All 4 of us listened. At first, there was nothing. Then came a faint metallic strike from somewhere below the road. Leah sat forward. "There." Another strike followed, weaker than the first. I reached for the door latch, but Joel caught my arm. "Wait." We confirmed the direction before anyone steps out. We listened again. The wind rose and buried every sound. For several seconds, I heard only my own breathing. Then 3 barks came through the whiteout, evenly spaced and unmistakable. "Koda." I opened the door before Joel could stop me and stepped into snow above my ankles. The wind nearly turned me sideways, but the barking came again from below the road. Through the moving white, I saw a dark shape set into the slope. A metal door trembled from something striking it on the other side. Joel reached me before I could take a second step down the slope. He caught the back of my jacket and pulled me against the snowcat. "You do not go alone," he said. "We secure the approach first." Every instinct in me wanted to run toward the shaking door, but the ground below the road was hidden beneath fresh snow. A drainage trench crossed the slope somewhere between us and the valve house, and one careless step could injure another person Molly needed. Tom anchored a rope to the snowcat, while Leah checked the slope. Joel clipped us in, then led the descent 1 measured step at a time. The barking stopped as we approached. That frightened me more than the storm. "Koda," I called. "It is Andrea." Something struck the metal door from inside. A rough bark followed, then Molly's voice. I could not understand the words, but it was hers. The bottom of the door was buried in packed snow. Joel cleared it while I pulled ice from the handle. The door moved less than an inch and stopped. "It is tied from inside," he said. Molly secured it against the wind. Joel widened the gap while I reached through. My glove touched Koda's leash, looped around an interior pipe. Tom passed down a rescue cutter. I sliced the fabric near the handle, and Joel pulled again. A dark shape surged into the opening. Koda planted himself between us and the room, shoulders lowered despite the tremor in his back legs. He did not growl, but I knew that posture. He was exhausted, in pain, and still guarding the person behind him. "Koda, higher," I said, using the old command that had once brought him to my side through noise and smoke. His ears shifted toward me. His eyes found mine, but he did not move. "It is me. You did your job. Release." He looked back into the room. Joel and I forced the door wider. I ducked beneath Koda's head and saw Molly curled against the wall beneath a reflective blanket. Her face was pale, but her eyes were open. I dropped to my knees and pressed 2 fingers against her neck. Her pulse was fast but present. When I touched her cheek, she leaned into my hand. Only then did Koda lower himself beside us. Molly's fingers closed around my sleeve. "Did they come back?" she asked. The question hurt more than any accusation. She had waited in that room for the people who had promised 2 minutes and left her to the storm. "No," I said. "But I did." Her eyes closed briefly. I called her name until she opened them again. Leah entered with the medical pack and took control before relief could make me careless. She checked Molly's breathing, pupils, and skin temperature, then wrapped another insulated layer around her. "Do not let her stand," she said. "We move her slowly." Molly tried to sit straighter. "Koda is hurt. We are checking him too." Tom crouched near the dog. Koda attempted to rise when he touched the harness, but his hind legs failed to straighten fully. He sank back with a strained breath. Fear split inside me. I had found my daughter alive, and in the same instant understood that Koda might have spent everything he had keeping her that way. Tom examined his legs and hips. No obvious break. He is cold and exhausted. The hip is painful, but he needs a veterinary exam. Molly reached across the blanket and gripped Koda's harness. "He stays with me. We need room to carry you," Leah said gently. "He stays where I can see him." I looked at Leah. We moved them together. Tom prepared a drag litter for Koda, while Joel and I lifted Molly onto the rescue sled. Her hand remained wrapped around the harness until the last possible moment. As I adjusted the blanket near Koda's neck, I noticed the identification pouch. The snap was still closed. Something firm rested beneath the emergency card, but I did not open it. Whatever Molly had hidden could wait. Her breathing could not. Inside the snowcat, warmth began to gather slowly. Leah warned me not to heat Molly too quickly. I held her hands between my palms while she monitored her. Molly spoke in broken pieces. "Grandma took my phone and the camera. Grandpa said he needed the tripod. They drove away. I know enough for now. You are safe." She shook her head. "They knew about the storm. The warning was on the car screen." Grandma turned it off. Joel heard her from the driver's seat. His hands tightened on the wheel. Molly looked toward Koda. He lay on the padded litter with his head turned toward her. "The box," she whispered. "In Grandma's car." Koda sat because of the box. Leah touched her shoulder. "No more. Save your strength." Molly's eyes found mine. "I believe you," I said. "You do not have to prove anything." Joel restarted the engine. For the first time since the sirens began, I allowed myself to feel the shape of Molly's hand inside mine. She was alive, but we had not won. She was cold and frightened. Koda could barely stand. My parents were still surrounded by people who did not know what they had done. Before the snowcat had moved 20 feet, another engine sounded above us. Joel stopped and called the patrol channel. No one answered from the upper ridge. "There is no second rescue snowcat assigned to West Ridge," he said. Through the side window, 2 lights appeared higher on the service road. They moved toward the old storage area beyond the valve house. Joel looked at Tom. "Who still has access to the equipment bay?" "Dennis, Paula, and senior maintenance." My parents had been told to remain at the base lodge. Instead, while everyone believed Molly might be dying, they had taken another machine back to the closed ridge. Not to search where they abandoned her. The lights were moving toward the old storage hut. "They heard us change the search area," I said. "They came back for whatever is in that building." Joel radioed base security. Dennis and Paula had disappeared through separate staff corridors minutes earlier. A utility snowcat was also missing. Leah looked at Molly. "She needs to go down now." "I am going with her." Joel turned in his seat. "If they remove what is in that hut, we may lose the reason they did this. Tom can take Molly and Koda directly to the infirmary. Leah stays with them." I looked at Molly. Every part of me refused to let her out of my sight again, but my parents were forcing one more choice onto us. Molly tightened her fingers around mine. "Go," she said slowly. "They came back for the camera. You do not have to think about that. They broke it before they left. They will say I imagined everything." I leaned close. "You are going down with Leah and Tom. Koda goes with you. No one separates you, and no one questions you until I arrive. Joel repeated the instruction over the radio and ordered the infirmary closed to everyone except medical staff and law enforcement. Only then did I release Molly's hand. The snowcat turned downhill, with Molly and Koda secured together inside. Joel and I remained with the second patroller, who had reached us from the lower checkpoint. Roped together, we followed the lights toward the storage hut. The other snowcat had stopped beside the building. Its cargo bed faced us. My father stood at the open storage door while my mother held a flashlight. Together, they dragged a locked black case across the threshold. Then the wind shifted. In the cargo bed behind them, beneath a maintenance tarp, I saw Molly's camera. Its screen was shattered, and the body had been crushed, as if someone had brought a boot down on it again and again. Joel raised one arm and shouted through the wind, "Dennis, Paula, step away from the case." My father turned toward us without releasing the metal handle. My mother lowered the flashlight, and for 1 second neither of them looked surprised to see me. They looked interrupted. Dad straightened. "We came back to find Molly. She was found below the service road," Joel said. "This hut is in the opposite direction." "We were checking every structure," Mom replied quickly. "We thought she might have reached this one." I looked at the locked case between them, and then at the shattered camera in the snowcat. "You were not searching," I said. "You were removing something from a building you told everyone did not matter." Dad's grip tightened on the case. "You do not understand what you are looking at. Then leave it where it is." Mom stepped closer to me, careful not to move beyond Joel's raised hand. "There may be hazardous equipment in that building," she said. "We could not allow a rescue team with no training to disturb it." Joel glanced toward the faded storage sign. "This structure is not listed on the current operations map. Why is hazardous equipment stored in an unmarked hut?" Dad answered without hesitation. "Mark Ellis handled that inventory." "Mark is on medical leave," Joel said. "That does not erase the decisions he made before he left." The case rested half inside the snowcat's cargo bed. Fresh snow covered the top, but the lower edge was clean where it had just crossed the hut floor. I did not touch it. Whatever was inside belonged in the hands of people trained to identify and secure it, not a mother trying to prove her parents had attempted to kill her child. "Do not open or move anything else," I told Joel. "Call the sheriff and the appropriate state unit. The hut, the snowcat, and everything inside it need to remain exactly as they are." Dad gave a bitter laugh. "You have been back on this mountain for 1 day, and now you think you are in charge of it. No. I think Molly almost died, because you believed you were." Joel radioed the base and requested law enforcement, medical transport, and personnel qualified to secure the storage area. Then he ordered my parents to place the snowcat key on the ground. Dad ignored him and moved toward the driver's door. The rescue snowcat blocked the narrow road below. Above us, the service route disappeared into drifts and unstable terrain. He could not drive forward without risking the slope, and he could not reverse past Joel's machine. There was nowhere to go. "Hand me the key," Joel repeated. Dad stopped with one hand on the door. My mother looked into the cargo bed and seemed to realize how much they had left in plain view. Besides Molly's broken camera, her phone lay beneath the tarp with the back cover removed and the battery missing. One of her purple gloves had been pushed against the side wall. Near the driver's seat sat the portable device Dad had used to enter the West Ridge gate. I pointed to the glove. "You said Molly was never in this vehicle." Mom looked at it as though she had never seen it before. "We found those things on the road," she said. "We thought they might show which way she went." The camera was beneath the tarp before enough snow collected to cover the cargo bed. "It did not fall there while you were searching." "You cannot know that." "I know you took her phone," Molly told me. For the first time, my mother's face lost all expression. Dad pulled the key from the ignition and threw it into the snow near Joel's boots. "You want to destroy everything because you are angry," he said. "You have no idea what it takes to keep a mountain operating. Every winter is payroll, insurance, inspections, fuel, weather, and one mistake that can close the doors forever." "One mistake?" His eyes moved toward the black case. One bad after. The sentence settled between us more heavily than the storm. Molly's terror, Koda's exhaustion, the hours spent searching the wrong ridge, and the possibility that I might never have found my daughter had become one bad afternoon in my father's mind. That afternoon was my daughter's life, I said. Mom came closer while Joel retrieved the key. Andrea, please listen before strangers arrive and turn this into something none of us can take back. You took it there when you left Molly. Her voice dropped until it sounded almost tender. Timber Ridge can cover every medical expense. We can establish a fund for her education and make sure she never worries about money. You only need to explain that the weather changed faster than expected, and everyone became confused. They had not yet received a full medical report. My mother did not know whether Molly would have permanent injuries, whether Koda would walk normally again, or whether my daughter would wake screaming for the rest of her childhood. She was already calculating the price of another story. There is nothing to discuss, I said. Any further communication goes through the investigators. You are her mother. You should be thinking about her future. I am. That is why you will never buy her silence. The first law enforcement team reached us with another patrol unit less than 15 minutes later. Joel gave them the key, the gate information, and a brief description of what we had found. I answered only what I had personally seen. I did not speculate about the case or repeat Molly's fragmented account as though it were a formal statement. My parents were escorted down separately. Mom continued calling my name until the storm swallowed her voice. I felt no victory watching them leave. I felt only the weight of how many chances they had been given to turn back, and how deliberately they had rejected each one. The drive to the county hospital took less than an hour, though it felt longer than the entire search. By the time I reached Molly's room, her wet outer layers had been removed and warm blankets covered her to the shoulders. Her color was better, but she still trembled in small waves. A nurse warned me that exhaustion, confusion, and fear could continue even after her temperature stabilized. Koda had been transported to an emergency veterinary clinic nearby. Tom called to say the examination showed severe exhaustion and increased inflammation in his arthritic hip, but no fracture or major internal injury. He would need fluids, medication, warmth, and rest. Molly listened from the bed. He is coming back? As soon as the veterinarian says he can. Her eyes closed with relief, then opened again. My camera? I sat beside her and took her hand. They broke it. She swallowed. Then nobody will believe why Koda sat down. I believe you. That is not the same as proving it. She looked toward the chair, where Koda's red harness rested inside a clear hospital bag. A nurse had removed it before he went to the clinic. The pocket, Molly said. I brought the harness to her. Her fingers were still stiff, so I opened the identification pouch while she watched. Behind Koda's emergency information card was a memory card, no larger than my thumbnail. Molly released a breath that sounded as though she had been holding it since West Ridge. I switched them when Grandma asked about the backup, she said. I thought she only wanted the video. I closed my hand around the card. You did enough. You do not have to carry the rest. A county investigator arrived after the doctor cleared a brief conversation. I gave her the memory card without copying it or sending the footage to anyone. Joel joined us by video from Timber Ridge, while the investigator opened the file on an evidence laptop. The first image showed Koda sitting beside my mother's SUV. Then my father crossed the frame, carrying the locked case. My mother's voice came clearly through the microphone. Mark's login still works. We only need the ridge open through Sunday. I watched the recording once. That was enough. Molly had not been abandoned because my parents panicked over one careless act. They had been hiding something long before we arrived, and when Koda exposed the edge of it, they chose to remove the child who had recorded it. The investigator stepped into the hallway and made several calls. When she returned, a man's tired voice came through her phone on speaker. He identified himself as Mark Ellis. I have been receiving treatment for almost 3 weeks, he said. I have not logged into the Timber Ridge system or signed an inventory record during that time. The investigator asked why West Ridge had originally been closed. There was a pause. I ordered it closed because one case was never accounted for. I looked at Molly sleeping beneath the hospital blanket. My parents had not merely hidden paperwork. They had known there was an unidentified danger somewhere on the ridge, where they left her to die. Molly remained under observation for 2 nights after the storm. Her temperature returned to normal, but recovery did not happen all at once. She tired after a few sentences, startled whenever a cart rattled past her door, and woke once convinced she could hear the West Ridge sirens again. I stayed beside her whenever the doctors allowed it. When investigators needed me, they came to a small consultation room down the hall, so Molly would not have to watch adults turn her terror into evidence. By the second afternoon, the pieces no longer looked like separate mistakes. Mark Ellis had marked one case as unaccounted for before he began medical leave. His original warning stated that West Ridge was to remain closed until the missing inventory was reconciled and the storage sites were inspected. Dennis and Paula had continued using Mark's active credentials after he left. They moved controlled avalanche equipment in my mother's private SUV, bypassed the primary inventory record, and prepared to reopen part of the ridge after the busy weekend. Joel delivered the local gate logs, the parking footage, and the rescue radio recordings. He also admitted that my father had pressured him more than once to delay closures or soften written concerns. I kept telling myself I was protecting the staff from unnecessary shutdowns, he said. I was really teaching Dennis that I could be pushed. Mark sent the investigators his original report and the messages confirming when he ordered the closure. Neither man asked me to forgive his silence. That mattered more than an apology designed to make me comfort them. The vehicle records showed my parents driving Molly and Koda through the West Ridge gate at 2:08 and returning 25 minutes later without them. The weather system showed that both of them had opened the advanced closure warning before they took Molly from the maintenance area. Her phone and broken camera had been recovered from their second snowcat. They could no longer argue that the storm surprised them. The clearest proof came after investigators obtained access to their devices. The messages had not appeared by luck. They were recovered with warrants, device records, and server data that placed them within the same minutes shown on the gate log. My mother had written, "Once the ridge closes, no one goes west until morning." My father had answered, "Take the camera, leave the dog with her. It explains why she went." I read the second message twice. They had not forgotten Koda was with Molly. They had counted on it. They wanted everyone to believe an old dog had wandered and a trusting child had followed. What they forgot was that Koda had spent his life holding position when leaving would have been easier. Age had slowed his body, but it had not changed the rule he lived by. When questioned separately, my parents began turning on each other. Paula claimed Dennis had intended only to frighten Molly long enough to destroy the recording. Dennis said Paula created the East Gully story and instructed him not to return once the sirens began. Neither explanation helped them. One had driven my daughter into a closed ridge. The other had designed the search that kept rescuers away from her. Both had read the warning. Both had returned for the cases instead of Molly. A lawyer representing them contacted me before Molly was discharged. He asked to meet in the hospital conference room and placed a 2-page statement on the table. It said Dennis and Paula had always intended to return. It said the weather had changed faster than expected. It said Molly, frightened and confused, had misunderstood their actions. In exchange for my signature, the family property would secure a medical trust, Molly's education, and any future treatment she might need. For most of my life, Timber Ridge had been presented as a sacred inheritance. Every compromise was for the next generation. Every silence protected what would someday belong to us. The paper in front of me offered Molly that inheritance in its purest form, money purchased with her own erased memory. I pushed it back and said, "My daughter does not need a future bought with a lie about why she almost lost it." The lawyer warned that without cooperation, the resort might close, and hundreds of workers could suffer. "The employees did not abandon Molly," I said. "Separate the operation from the owners. Put it under independent management while the investigation continues." I had no authority to order that outcome. I could only refuse to help my parents use the resort as a shield. My statement, Joel's records, and Mark's original closure notice allowed county and state officials to consider limited operation under an outside manager instead of treating every employee as part of the crime. Dennis and Paula were formally charged with offenses related to child endangerment, obstruction of the rescue, evidence destruction, false records, and safety violations. The prosecutor made no promise about a final verdict or sentence. The case would take time. Molly came home before I saw my parents again. She was physically stable, but she still needed monitoring, therapy, and more sleep than she wanted to admit. Koda returned from the veterinary clinic with medication, strict activity limits, and a shaved patch on one leg from his fluids. My last meeting with Dennis and Paula during those first days took place in a secured interview room at the sheriff's office. Their attorney sat between them, but distance had already opened, where loyalty once pretended to be. Mom looked smaller without Timber Ridge behind her. Even then, she spoke as though I were the one who had crossed a line. "How can you do this to your own family?" she asked. "You left my child to die and called the mountain your family. I am choosing the one who came home." Dad leaned forward. "The town will blame you when paychecks stop. They will remember your name long after this case is over." A few days earlier, I might have explained that I had asked for independent management. I might have defended myself, listed their choices, or begged them to understand what they had done. Instead, I stood up. Their story had survived for years because I kept entering it to argue my innocence. Walking away was the first answer they could not rewrite. When I returned home, the living room lights were low. Molly had fallen asleep on the couch beneath a blanket, one hand resting on Koda's neck. He lay on a padded bed beside her, gray muzzle near her wrist, as if he were still counting every breath. I had not destroyed our family. I had only stopped protecting the people who had. Molly opened her eyes when I sat beside her. "Does Koda have to go back to work?" she asked. I looked at the old dog sleeping beneath her hand. "No," I said. "He already finished the only mission that mattered." Koda had finished his last mission, but healing did not begin with a clean ending. For the first few weeks, Molly woke whenever a truck backed up outside or an ambulance passed our street. The warning tone from our microwave made her flinch so badly that I changed the setting. Once, a school fire drill sent her into a bathroom stall, where a teacher found her sitting on the floor with both hands pressed over her ears. Car rides became difficult too. She checked the door handle before I started the engine and asked me not to lock the doors until we were moving. If the automatic locks clicked unexpectedly, she reached for my hand before she seemed to realize she was doing it. I never told her she was safe, as though saying it could make her body believe me. I told her where we were going, how long it would take, and who would be there. I let her check the doors twice if she needed to. Some days she talked about West Ridge in careful pieces. Other days she did not want to hear my parents' names. Her therapist told me not to turn silence into another demand. Molly had already spent hours trapped inside a story adults wanted her to accept. Recovery meant allowing her to choose when she spoke. I did not ask whether she would forgive Dennis and Paula. I did not ask whether she wanted to see them. Their attorneys made several requests for supervised contact, but Molly shook her head before I finished explaining the first one. That was enough. Koda recovered more slowly than he wanted to. The veterinarian prescribed medication for his hip, short walks, and several weeks without stairs. I moved his bed into the living room and placed runners across the hardwood so his back feet would not slide. He slept more than he used to. Sometimes his legs moved in dreams, and Molly would sit beside him until they became still. Whenever she left the room, one of his eyes opened. If she stayed gone too long, he pushed himself up and waited near the hallway. He was no longer strong enough to follow her everywhere, but he still counted where she was. Guilt followed me with the same persistence. I had allowed Molly to walk away with my parents because I wanted to prove I was not controlling. I had seen the closed ridge, heard my father minimize the weather, and watched Joel hesitate before Dad's decisions. I had noticed every warning and softened each one because I wanted Molly to have grandparents. At night, I replayed the moment she left the public path and wondered which sentence might have stopped her. Her therapist eventually asked me a question I had been avoiding. If Molly trusted them because you trusted them for 20 minutes, does that make you responsible for what they chose to do? The honest answer took time. I was responsible for rebuilding safety. I was responsible for listening to my instincts sooner. I was responsible for never placing family harmony above Molly again. I was not responsible for my parents deciding that a child could be sacrificed to protect their reputation. That guilt belonged to them. The criminal case moved more slowly than the news reports wanted. Dennis remained in custody after the court found that he had access to equipment, records, and employees who might be pressured. Paula was released under strict supervision and prohibited from contacting Molly or me directly. The charges included child endangerment, obstruction of the rescue, destruction of evidence, falsification of records, and violations connected to the hidden storage sites. Their attorneys challenged every detail, and no final sentence had been reached by spring. I stopped following every filing. Justice did not require me to spend each morning inside their defense. Timber Ridge remained closed long enough for independent inspectors to examine the storage buildings, the avalanche control records, and the West Ridge access route. The missing case was eventually located in a sealed maintenance trench where it had been moved without proper documentation. No one was injured recovering it. Under temporary outside management, the lower mountain reopened with restricted operations. West Ridge remained closed. Joel kept his position only after agreeing to independent oversight and new reporting rules. Mark returned as a consultant long enough to help rebuild the inventory system and train a second person to verify every entry. Neither man became part of our family or appeared at our house seeking forgiveness. They simply did the work they should have done earlier. Most employees kept their jobs. Hours were reduced for a while, but the town did not collapse as my father had predicted. The mountain continued without him, which may have been the truth he feared most. A family attorney later informed me that I still held a small voting interest inherited from my grandfather. For several days, people assumed I would use it to take control of Timber Ridge. I signed it away under terms that prevented Dennis or Paula from reclaiming it during the investigation. My share went into the structure overseeing the workers and long-term safety repairs. I did not want my parents' chair at the table. I wanted the table to stop requiring someone like them. Molly returned to her school project near the end of winter. Her teacher offered an extension, then offered to excuse the assignment completely. Molly refused both. She sat at the kitchen table with her camera, a new one donated quietly by parents at her school, and opened the folder labeled Koda's Last Patrol. For several minutes, she watched the early footage. Koda walking beside the fire pit. Koda resting his chin on her boot. Koda turning toward the camera whenever she whispered his name. Then she changed the title, The One Who Stayed. She did not include the footage of my parents' SUV, the black case, or the sentence about Mark's login. Those clips belonged with the investigation. She did not use images of the hospital or the shattered camera either. One afternoon, she asked whether she should include a few seconds recorded by a patroller after the valve house door opened. Koda stood between her and the rescuers, looking back until I reached her. "It is your story," I said. "You decide what people are allowed to see." She watched the clip twice, then closed it. "I do not want the worst thing that happened to us to become the most important thing about him." Instead, she filmed Koda sleeping beside her bedroom door. In the shot, his paws twitched once before he lifted his head and checked that she was still at her desk. When he saw her, he rested his muzzle again. That became the final image of her film. Her narration explained that retirement was not the end of a working dog's value. Koda walked more slowly now. He needed medicine and help getting into the car. He slept through most afternoons and no longer wore a service harness. None of that made him less worthy of love. When When Molly's class watched the film, she sat beside me rather than at the front. She did not speak after the credits. She did not need to explain anything the film had already said. A letter from Paula arrived the following week. Her handwriting covered 6 pages. I read the first sentence, which said she hoped time would help me understand the impossible pressure they had faced. I stopped there. I placed the letter in an envelope for my attorney and closed the drawer. I did not burn it or send an angry answer. My mother had spent years turning every response into another doorway. I was allowed to leave that door closed. On the last cold weekend of the season, I drove Molly and Koda to a quiet meadow outside town. It was not part of Timber Ridge. There were no lifts, no warning sirens, and no hail name carved into a sign. The snow was shallow and firm enough for Koda's hip. Molly checked the car door before stepping out, then clipped a long line to his collar. We walked slowly across the flat ground. Koda stopped often to investigate rabbit tracks and patches of grass showing through the snow. Molly matched his pace without urging him forward. After a while, she looked at me. "Can I let the line go?" I checked the open meadow and nodded. She placed the end gently on the snow. Koda walked several yards ahead. His steps were uneven, and his gray muzzle stayed low as he followed a scent. No command called him back. No whistle sounded. He stopped on his own. Then he turned and looked at Molly, before shifting his eyes to me. After confirming we were both there, he walked back and stood between us. I rested my hand on his head, while Molly leaned against his shoulder. My parents had spent their lives teaching me that family was something you protected from the truth. Koda taught us something simpler. Family was the one who stayed when the storm gave them every reason to leave.